Welcome back to the Ask Us Anything podcast, everybody.
What is up?
We are here with Pastor Derek.
It's been a while for me, I feel like.
Well, I feel like I'm getting a lot of one-on-one time.
Yeah,
I got
it's true.
you, I got Nathaniel. This is great.
One-on-one
You know, we're really growing here in our
Absolutely.
bonds.
Absolutely. It's true.
This week, hell.
The topic is hell.
The topic is hell, serious topic, and we're going to only talk about that. We're not going to address, we have some other questions that came in, great questions, but we think sometimes it's just best to take one thing.
Yeah.
So, before we start, I have a quote here,
Sure.
which this has always been stuck in my head ever since I heard it, which was, I think it's D.L. Moody, where he said, "I cannot preach on hell unless I preach with tears." And that's always stuck in my head
So good.
as, yeah, I mean, it kind of speaks for itself. And I guess before Moody's time, the common way of preaching on hell, it was more common to kind of preach on hell with almost some glee
Yeah.
within the preaching style.
Yeah.
And people have a lot of different thoughts about hell. Hell is obviously one of the largest objections, I would say. I'm not to speak on behalf of atheists or whatnot, but probably one of the largest objections within New England to people. I mean, from people towards Christianity, saying, you know, how could a loving God condemn people to hell?
Right.
So let's start, I guess, talking about what is hell,
Yeah.
what is hell not, and yeah, where do you want to go? We can take this. I mean,
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but wasn't the question something like, did God create it?
that's a good point. Is I forgot what the actual question was. I
Yeah.
just saw hell in it, and I'm like, we're talking about hell this week. What was the actual
but
question?
I think the exact question was, did God create hell?
Okay.
And so, you know, if we start there, I think the simple form or the simple way of answering that question has to be the answer of yes. And one of the passages that, as I was thinking about this and just kind of reflecting on the question in particular, a verse that came to my mind was a place in Matthew 25 where Jesus is, if you remember, he's telling the parable of the sheep and the goats.
Okay.
Which, again, back to your comment about, you know, one of the biggest stumbling blocks for a lot of skeptics today is this idea of God sending people. How could a loving God send people to hell?
Yeah.
But even to get to and help us understand the original question of, did God create hell? There's this phrase or this statement that Jesus makes in that story of the parable of the sheep and the goats, where when the people that have rejected God, rebelled against him, when they're being consigned to the place of eternal punishment, as that would be kind of the historical way that people would describe hell, Jesus uses a particular statement. He says, "Depart from me to the eternal fire that was prepared," and this is the key part, "that was prepared for the devil and his angels." And so, like, coming back to the original question, what this phrase kind of stuck out to me, and as I was thinking and meditating on this, it just made me think about the fact that we have to first approach this topic with the recognition of the fact that God's intention or desire, according to Jesus' statement there, was that it was designed for the devil and all of the rebellious angels, right? Like the original design for eternal punishment was the eternal justice of God's eternal justice being given to those who had rebelled against him in the heavenlies. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, like, just as a starting point, I think it's really important for us to just recognize the fact that the way that Jesus approached and taught about hell, and we'll get more into some of the other phrases and the historicity of it and some of the concepts behind it in just a minute, but it's really, really key to start, I think, right at the beginning, to remember that in essence, an extreme way of saying what Jesus said is that God's original intent for hell was never for humans. To put it, you know, kind of in a stark way, right?
That's interesting.
Because if we're understanding what Jesus is saying, It is prepared. You're going to go to the place that was prepared, to the eternal fire that was prepared. What was God's intention? Why did he prepare it? Right? Because that idea of preparation means that there's a goal for it, right? And the goal, and this is consonant not only with what you read in Matthew 25, but it's what you see even in Revelation 20. The lake of fire is designed for the devil and the fallen angels. It's not originally designed for humans, which kind of leads me into another quote. So to your point, and to the quote that you used from Moody of, needing to, anytime we talk about hell, we need to approach it with hearts of compassion. One of the things that C.S. Lewis talks about, and I can't remember what book this is in, but he talks about how hell is a place that the more that you think about it, and C.S. Lewis, again, was brilliant on some of these topics, the more that you think about it, hell is a door that is locked from the inside.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Do you know where that is? I can't remember exactly where it is. It's just sticking out.
I don't remember where, but he has a bunch of like really profound thoughts on how we think about hell.
Right.
Yeah. But you
Yeah.
continue.
And so my thought in regard to that, part of what Lewis is trying to get at, and this kind of just maybe takes us into this idea again about hell not being prepared originally for humans, but for the rebellious and fallen angels. What Lewis is trying to get at is that in our understanding of God's consigning people to it, it is basically, and this is another quote from Lewis, maybe even in the same context, if memory serves, where he says there are only two kinds of people in the world. There are those who say to God, thy will be done. And there are others to whom God says, thy will be done. And those are really your only two options. And for those who say to God, thy will be done, the natural place that they want to be, because they want God to be God, the natural place that they want to be is in the presence of God. The natural place that people who want their own will, though, the natural place that lands them is a place separate from God, which is, again, a place that he originally had not designed for the pinnacle of his creation, being human beings. But it's a place that we as human beings have voluntarily chosen.
Yeah.
And it's like Lewis says, it's a door that we end up locking from the inside.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't know if you want to respond to any of that, but I've got some more thoughts, and then maybe we can get into some of the New Testament nuances of this.
No, I was trying to find it right now. I found the quote that you were talking about, thy will be done. And those whom God says in the end, thy will be done. All that are in hell choose it. Without the self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find. Those who knock, it is open. He talks, I'm trying to think of what he also talks about, where he talks about how, the first assumption is, okay, if our souls live on forever, then maybe that characteristic, that small thing within ourselves, that complaint, it may not seem like much, or that anger within us may not see that much in terms of how much it's grown in our lifetime, right? It starts out as this P, and by the time I'm paraphrasing and kind of, this isn't going to be perfect, but say you have this anger, I'm taking that characteristic, and that anger grows from a pea to a walnut over your lifetime. You may not notice that, but if you take that and expand it out through eternity, that thing becomes the sun, right? And eventually that anger is all that you're left with, because in eternity, those characteristics grow on forever. And if you're not essentially oriented towards Christ, then without realizing it, you fall into hell, right? And this is in some way self-imposed. And in that sense, the door is locked from the inside.
Right.
He talks about that.
And I do think that the flip side of that, Jonathan Edwards talks a lot about, right? Like that, in a new creation, even like Paul says in Philippians 1, right? The thing that God has begun in us, in the work of sanctification, God is going to carry on infinitely, right? He's one day going to bring it to completion, as Paul says in Philippians 1:6. But completion just means maturity,
Yeah.
right? It's going to mature over the course of our lives. And this is kind of even Jesus's point, by the way, back in Matthew 25, right? Like there are these two groups of people, some of whom, when they see the thirsty, they give them drink. When they see the people in prison, they go and visit them. And then there are these other people who close their hearts to other people. And Jesus says, and when you've done these things to the least of these, you've done it to me. But to use that analogy that you were just talking about, Matt, if you think about the idea of us closing our hearts to God and closing our hearts to our fellow humans this side of glory, but then carrying that out for all of eternity.
Yeah.
Again, as C.S. Lewis talks about elsewhere, I think this is in The Weight of Glory. He says, you've never met a mere mortal.
Yeah.
And the people that we meet on an everyday basis, if we were to see them after death, they would either be someone that is so glorious that we'd be tempted to fall down and worship, or they would be so heinous that we would want to run away in fear.
Yeah.
And again, his point is just being carried on, right? Like what begins, the work that God begins in us, he's going to carry on and on into eternity, in maturity, for those who say to God, thy will be done. But for those who say, no, I want my will, I want to be locked in my own prison. God, in essence, is constantly kind of holding the rope. Like if you imagine life being like this stream that is going to carry people away to their destruction, God is holding the rope. But there's a point at which that rope gets let go of, right? And the current naturally takes them to an extreme that Lewis again is trying to just kind of highlight with some of this writing. And some of this stuff again is partially what we as biblical interpreters, or like C.S. Lewis, have to kind of philosophize on.
Yeah.
Because again, like there are a number of texts within Scripture that again talk about hell, talk about the ramifications of rebellion against God. But again, some of what is really, really clear, and I think the place that we have to start, is the fact that this is not God's design for humans. His design, his desire for humans has always been to live in the place that he has designed for us according to his good word and his good rule. And we'll even talk a little bit, though not under the context of hell, but we're going to talk on Sunday, because we're, again, doing this series in the book of Judges. And we're going to talk a little bit about the difficulty that there is sometimes that people have with the idea of just God being just, or God showing the Bible talking about violence. How do we deal with that?
Yeah.
And sometimes I think when we think about hell, our assumption is, again, how can a good and loving God, how does hell square with God's goodness and God's love? And I think biblically what you see is it's the flip side of it, right? Like the idea of the opposite of love is not anger. The opposite of love is it's almost like indifference.
Yeah.
Right. And God is not indifferent to our sin. God is also not indifferent to our choice. And those things carry consequences. But again, hell, biblically understood, is not a place that God originally prepared for us as human beings.
Yeah.
So,
down to some, and it's funny with something like hell, for most of my life, I understood the basics of it. And in my head, I said, well, that's enough. And because some people really get into like, I want to know every little aspect of, okay, so is it a physical place? Is it actually fire? Is it
Right.
this or that? Is
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
is the devil sitting there on the throne like I see in the movies, or is he annihilated? Is it, you know what I mean? There's all these different things. And I've been like, well, I can understand the gospel without understanding the nuances of these little things. But I do have questions.
Right.
Like the more I think about creation in terms of the arc of creation, where does hell fit in terms of, let's start at the beginning, right? There's the garden. Is because some people define hell as, essentially being in the absence of God's presence. And I've heard it defined, you've given a good description here, but at what point was hell created? And is it a physical place?
Yeah.
Was it outside the garden? Was everything outside the garden hell? And then, I don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love the question, and I think this will allow us to kind of get into even the way that a New Testament, a person who was living in the days of Jesus, I think would have understood it.
Sure.
So, the question is it a physical place?
Sure.
My answer to that would be, well, yes, it is. That being said, when was it created? Not 100% sure, but we do know that, again, according to Jesus in Matthew 25, it was created or prepared for the devil and his rebellious minions. I don't think that the New or the Old Testament, even in the story of creation, gives us the image of everything outside of the garden being, hell. I think everything outside of the garden was still part of God's good creation.
Yeah.
And it was supposed to be cultivated or cultured, if you will, the same root between those words, under the dominion of human beings, those people that God, as the crown of his creation, had created to be his kind of vice regents, so to speak. And so I think hell it's someplace separate, which again, if we can, this is kind of weird,
Sure.
but let's jump from Genesis for just a second to the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
Because one of the interesting things, and I remember Sean McDonough at the seminary who I took the book of Revelation from, he's a Revelation scholar. One of the comments that he made when we were going through some of the latter parts of Revelation, if you look in particular at Revelation 20 and where the lake of fire, which is again kind of another pictographic, if you will, depiction of hell.
Yeah.
It's kind of an imaginative way of describing it because we're not 100% sure what it's like. Though, again, Jesus said it's an eternal fire,
Yeah.
right? And I'll talk more about how a New Testament person would have understood that in the day of Jesus in just a second. But if you pay attention to the book of Revelation, one of the comments that McDonough made that I thought was really fascinating, and it actually, again, kind of helped at an emotional level for me. Because again, hell is not an easy topic to talk about, going back to the original quote, right? Like we should do this with tears. If you look at where judgment takes place in Revelation 20, and where the lake of fire is kind of described, it's described in kind of this nowhere space. It's described in between, like literally in the text, it's described in between the kind of the rolling up of the first creation and before the descent of the new creation.
Interesting.
In Revelation 21. So it's almost like this nowhere place. And one of the things that McDonough, I just remember it made a really big impact on me. He said this in one way, I just wonder if what John is trying to get at, what he was seeing when he was having this revelation was, and what he's trying to communicate through this vision, what God is ultimately trying to communicate is this has no place within my creation. It doesn't belong.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Like it doesn't belong in the original creation, back to your original question, but it also doesn't belong in the new creation.
Yeah.
So judgment and the lake of fire is described as taking place in this nowhere space in between. So that's like Revelation 20, right around, I know verse 10 is talking about where the devil and his angels are being cast into the lake of burning sulfur. And then all those who rebelled against God as well. But I think that's really important for us to think about and get our minds around, or maybe our hearts around even. That's just it's again an apocalyptic way of describing how this does not belong either in God's good creation or in God's new creation, his good original creation or his perfect new creation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And that always has been something that has stuck with me and helped me to think about it. One of the other things that I think is really key to latch onto, and I remember when I was studying and preaching one time out of Matthew 18, it led me into a little rabbit hole on a study of hell, because the Greek word Gehenna, which, if you read the ESV or certain kind of more literal translations of the New Testament, sometimes you'll come across that word. And Gehenna is basically an English transliteration of a Greek word that is actually based on an older Hebrew word that literally means valley of wailing. The Hebrew word is something to the effect of Gehenom. And it's the word again is just this idea. It's the word for valley and the word for wailing. But one of the things, and it sometimes is translated hell in the New Testament.
Yeah.
So if your eye causes you to sin, Jesus says, right? Cut it out, because it's better for you to enter into life with one eye than it is for you to go into Gehenna. That's one of the places. And then also in Matthew 18. But one of the things that I remember when I was studying that I found out is that Gehenna or Gehenom is actually a literal physical place outside of Jerusalem. It is the lowest valley, if I remember right, like on the southwest side of the city of Jerusalem. And this is where some historical context and even some of like C.S. Lewis's thinking and philosophizing may have been coming to bear on this. Originally, if you trace this idea or this location all the way back into the Old Testament, you would end up in 2 Kings, where some of the people under the wicked king Manasseh, who was a king in Israel, led the Israelites into worshiping Molech, and it's the valley in which the people would sacrifice their own children to the god Molech. And again, you can consult any New Testament and Old Testament dictionary, and you'll get into the history of this. But a lot of people actually think that one of the reasons why Jesus used that phrase when he would describe eternal punishment, if you will, a place where the fire never dies, and the worm never dies and the fire is never quenched, as some of the language in the New Testament elsewhere. That is descriptive of Gehenna. But what happened was that is something in a very real way on earth that we unleashed. Yeah. Does that make sense? Like human beings created hell on earth by idolatry and by actually sacrificing some of the most important relationships, i.e. with our children, to idols, to false gods, to demons, right? And what ended up happening by Jesus's day, Gehinnom, the valley of wailing, was a trash dump. Yeah. So if you had trash, like you can imagine, there wasn't trash service. You didn't wheel your trash out to the curb in the New Testament, right? Like you had to take your trash somewhere. And what people would do is there were fires that were burning in Gehinnom, in the valley of wailing, and people would take their trash and they would just dump it down into the valley. And that was the reason why the fire was never quenched, right? But what was sustaining the fire? Our trash, our garbage. And when did the fires get stoked originally? Way back in the Old Testament, when idolatry and child sacrifice came into the picture. And so that's the picture that Jesus is using. And it's in essence, part of what Jesus is trying to again describe, that I think Lewis is trying to catch onto or latch onto here, is this is stuff that people are deciding on or choosing.
Yeah.
Right? Just like the people in the Old Testament chose to worship the idols and sacrifice their children. Just like we generate trash, so to speak, and we just keep pouring it deeper and deeper into the valley, right? But it's our sin that continues to stoke the fire.
Yeah.
And so those would have been the images and the ideas that the people in Jesus's day would have associated with hell. Not this, God being a capricious, malevolent, vindictive, being who just loves throwing people into fire.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, Ezekiel 33, Ezekiel 18, there are so many different places. 2 Peter 3, God does not delight in the death of the wicked. His desire is that all would come to repentance. Right.
Yeah.
Like, that's his desire. So again, this is a door we're locking,
Yeah.
From the inside.
I was actually just listening to Tim Keller, one of his sermons on hell, and it was the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and he talks about when Lazarus is, up with in heaven with Abraham, and the rich man is in hell, and he was right when I turned it off. He would Keller was talking about how I think when God refers to the rich man, he says, like, the term in which he refers to him, there's like pathos, there's sadness in the language God is using towards the rich man. It's not this glee, it's there's pain in
Right.
God seeing the rich man, and there, even then the rich man is he's still making these these decisions in a way.
Right.
But
Yeah.
like you're saying, it's God doesn't sit delighting in people's pain.
Right. And one of the other things that I think about when I think about this question and the topic of hell, it reminds me of something that I'm pretty sure that I read this in a book called Exclusion and Embrace by a guy named Miroslav Volf.
What a name.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the things that he talks about that, and he talks about it a little bit in the context of a discussion about eternal punishment and or, the concept of hell.
Yeah.
But one of the points that he makes is that a lot of times it's really hard for a lot of Westerners who have grown up in, by and large, peace,
Yeah.
affluence,
Yeah. We got it good.
a good, yeah, we have it good. We have even as broken as all of our systems are, and they're all broken, our justice system is still probably, the shining light, if you can imagine that, of the whole world, right? But Miroslav Volf actually grew up in, if I remember right, it was part of the former Soviet bloc, but like he had been through and seen countless wars,
Yeah.
some genocide, things like that.
Famine.
Yeah, just all kinds of devastation and heartache. And one of the points that he made was that when you read passages of scripture that deal with justice, or you deal with the idea of God giving the wicked their just deserts.
Yeah.
If Miroslav Volf just makes the statement, if you grew up in places like I grew up, you would actually be able to latch onto that a little bit more.
Sure.
And you'd be able to not again, not celebrate it, but long for justice to roll down.
Sure.
Right? Like, again, there's still pathos. You still feel, because there, but for the grace of God go I, right?
Yeah.
Like, I could just as easily be in that state. And so if I want to talk about this, I have to be willing to do it with tenderness and compassion. And yet at the same time, like, if you're watching, or reading through the epic, Lord of the Rings or something like that, by the time of the last battle, when you see the orcs being defeated, you're in one sense experiencing an aspect of, this is good. And it is actually appropriate and right.
Yeah.
There's some form of, again, it's not glee, but it's the idea of just triumph, that justice is being served
Yeah.
in this instance. And that's just another way that I think about this, because it's as if with the preparation of hell for the devil and his angels, God is in essence one day going to say, you can have what you want.
Yeah.
But, living in a space that is eternally separated from God is the most hellish nightmare.
Yeah.
That it's beyond what any of us could ever fathom.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the reasons why some of these, or some of the, the images, biblical images of Gehinnom and other things end up getting used as a physical place where the people of Jesus's day would be able to be like, well, man, I don't want to be a part of that.
Yeah.
Right. And Jesus kind of saying, well, if you choose to live life apart from God, that is what you're in essence preparing yourself for.
Mm-hmm.
And God will one day say to you, just as he is saying to the wicked fallen angels, I must give you what you want. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. You've sparked, I have a quote and then a question on the imagery of hell that you're talking about.
Yeah.
I've heard Tim Keller multiple times when he says, people come up to him and they say, do you really think hell is this lake of fire? And he says, if I were to guess, I think it's more probable than not that it's not a lake of fire.
Right.
And they breathe a sigh of relief. And then he responds with, or he adds, I think it's probably something infinitely worse.
Right.
And
yeah.
And it's like we have this imagery, but what he's getting at is the imagery is just doing its best to capture what being in the absence of God and what being left to our own devices and what an eternity of getting what we ask for.
Right.
When that thing is an idol, when that thing is something other than God. Right.
Even to that point too, it's really fascinating when, like, again, you go all the way back to Genesis and there was in Genesis 1, you remember the image of the Spirit hovering over the face of the deep?
Yeah.
So in biblical parlance, the deep, the ocean, lakes are always the place of chaos. They're the place of disorder and fear, right? Like and it's even the place of evil, right? So like in another point in John's Apocalypse in the Revelation, there is a beast that rises out of the sea, right? And to the Jewish mind, which again, I'm kind of slightly scared of the ocean, so I get it. As you should be. There's this idea, I know, right? There are scary things in the ocean. There's this fear that's automatically created in the hearts and minds of a Jewish person with that image. And so I wonder if that's one of the reasons why the word lake gets used. But also in the new creation in Revelation 21, this is one of the reasons why the new creation is described as having no more sea. And I don't think literally, going back to the question that Tim Keller gets asked, to flip it, I don't think that there's actually not going to be bodies of water in the new creation. And so now all the people who love going out on the ocean and going boating and water
Sure.
skiing and stuff like that, they're breathing a sigh of relief, right? But what I think is being described there is that place of chaos,
Yeah.
that place of disorder, that place of fear is going to be totally done away with. It actually is going to be in that nowhere place between God's good creation that he created as cosmos that we brought back into disorder and chaos. And it's the space in between that good creation and the perfect creation, God's new creation. But that's, to Keller's point, it's a lake because it's scary, it's chaotic, it's disordered, and it's burning with fire because there's this idea of punishment and the idea of torture
Yeah.
in many respects. So
Yeah. Yeah. Going back a little bit further of what you were talking about, a lot of objections is kind of this idea that the crime doesn't fit the punishment. And you've talked in prior podcasts that there is an aspect like of hell that is punitive. If we're to say, well, the crime does fit the punishment, is part of the gap there between the objectors and our perspective, or not our perspective, or God's perspective, understanding of the severity of the crime? Or assuming, I'm saying if the crime fits the punishment,
yeah.
if we're saying that's true, and they're saying the crime doesn't fit the punishment, where do you think the gap is? Do you think they think the punishment is too harsh? Do you think that they think the crime is too small? Because we're saying they're equal,
Right.
and it's just. Do you think they get anything wrong there in that calculation?
Yeah, I think ultimately yes, and I think the place where there is the discord there is, I think we forget about the infinite holiness of God, right? Because if God is infinitely holy, then to transgress him, his will, his world, the grain of the universe, and even others made in his image, if God is infinitely holy, then to transgress an infinitely holy God is deserving of an infinitely just and heinous punishment, right?
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that this ought to do in our minds, and yet I think a lot of times our minds never go to the cross, but it also ought to make us think about Jesus on the cross, right? Like, was it just like 6 hours of worth of torture that he endured, right? Like, was it just like a really bad day?
Yeah.
It was just a really bad day for Jesus. No, like the reason why he was being undone in the Garden of Gethsemane, and I think it was Nathaniel a number of weeks ago mentioned this, right? Like in one of his sermons, that Jesus was feeling the weight of the judgment of God. He was already smelling, if you will, the fires of hell. And this is one of the reasons we talked on a previous podcast as well as to why in the Apostles' Creed, there's that phrase, he descended into hell. I think this is why, right? Like Jesus was sniffing on the cross. He was sniffing the punishment that we deserve.
Yeah.
Right. And again, the idea there is that when you transgress an infinitely holy God, I think the problem is that we don't understand the depth of our sin.
Yeah.
One of the things we're going to talk about, actually, the preview for the sermon this week is,
Although this podcast will probably come out right after.
perfect.
Yeah.
Then you'll
You've
be able to
just heard.
You've just heard in a sermon if you listen to the sermon. There's this place in Judges 3, and it repeats. It's the kind of introductory phrase before you meet all of the major judges in the book. It says, "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord." But then what's described right after that, so that's kind of the general statement. It says they forgot the Lord their God and they worshiped the Baals and the Asherahs. So part of the thing we're going to explore that I'm going to talk about in my first point on Sunday is this idea of, is that the way that we describe our idolatry? Would I label my idolatry as evil? Right? Which again, it really ties into this question. Right? Does the crime fit the punishment? Well, is is your crime evil?
Yeah.
Well, I don't like to use that word. I would like to change that word a little bit. Well, sorry, but we're not the ones who get to label that, right? Like, we are not infinitely holy. We have traces of righteousness. We're glorious ruins, as Francis Schaeffer used to say. So we have traces of the glory of God, original righteousness, if you will, traces of that. But it's been so marred and so messed up by original sin that I can actually be described as evil. And the things that I do can be rightly described as doing evil, even though I don't like the description. It doesn't sit emotionally well with me. Like, I think about Hitler as evil, right? It's
Yeah.
easy to label that dude as evil.
Yeah.
But the things that I do, I would prefer not to say it that way. Well, I don't get that determination, right? I mean, Judges 3 says that the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of God. And we'll talk more about that, even that phrase, because that has biblical connections. There's a problem with the way that my eyes see versus the way that God's eyes see. I try to be wise in my own eyes, as Proverbs says, right? But I need to see through the eyes of God. And so anytime I'm making this calculus of, well, I don't think the punishment fits the crime, I'm not seeing it through the eyes of God. I'm not seeing it as being truly evil. And even going back to something maybe we talked about earlier too, I'm not seeing that evil carried out to its infinite degree, right? Because that's what's going to happen. I've locked myself in a prison that I don't want out of, and I'm forever going to be there. And it's not going to get better. That fire, the inward fire, is going to continue to burn. It's not just going to keep smoldering. It's going to be stoked, right?
What do you say to someone who's listening to this right now and they're like, what are you talking about? I don't want your Jesus, but I also don't want to be locked into this. Like, are they missing something? Like, are they saying, I wouldn't choose that? I wouldn't choose that. Are they looking at the wrong thing? Are they not realizing something there? What are they missing?
Yeah, I think ultimately what you're missing in one sense is even Jesus's his statement of, then follow me. Right? Like, the idea, it goes back even to the parable of the sheep and the goats. In one sense, is that there's not like a middle ground. You know, it's not like Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and Pol Pot and, Mao Zedong. It's not like those guys are all the ones that it'll just be a handful of people consigned to hell. All those people that we really know are evil. And then there's this category of I'm morally neutral, right? Like, I'm somehow gonna, and I think this is the way our minds typically work, right? It's like, yeah, I do some bad stuff, but I also do some good stuff too. And our minds naturally, I think this is what Paul talks about when he describes the idea of works of the law, right? Like, our minds naturally think somehow I'm going to be able to balance the scales.
Yeah.
And, my good deeds ought to be able to outweigh or at least equal my bad deeds. And that's just not, it's just not a biblical conception. Scripture says, like in Romans, Paul says that anything that is not born of faith is sin. Anything. If it's not born of faith, then it's sin. Or again, like Jesus says, you either follow me or you don't, right? And if you follow me, he basically says, I will ensure that you end up with me. Like in John 14, Jesus says, I'm going away to prepare a place for you. It's that same word, actually. There is an eternal fire that is prepared for the devil and his angels. But Jesus in John 14 says, I'm going to prepare a place for you, my disciples, those who follow me. And the disciples are like, well, where are you going? And he's like, well, right now, you can't come with me. And they're like, well, what's the way? And Jesus says, I'm the way. And so I think that that's what people are missing. They're missing this idea. They think there are three categories, right? Like, there are all the evil people. There are the people that are kind of a mixed bag. And then there are the religious people, the goody two shoes kinds of people. And Jesus would actually say, no, there are only the kinds of people that are have received and are resting in me and me alone, my righteousness alone, my taking the punishment, my smelling the fires and tasting the fires of hell for you, or those who will, and and those who again follow him into glory, or there are those who are going to try to hack it on their own,
Yeah.
so to speak.
On what you're saying, I was trying to find the quote, but there was, and tell me if you've heard this, there's someone was talking about, I think the context was they were like on a beach in Germany or something, and they're seeing essentially like Nazis on vacation at the beach. And they're saying the shocking thing was just seeing how normal they were,
Yeah.
right? Like they're thinking of Nazis, they have this, these monsters in their head.
Right.
And then they're saying, no, when you meet Nazis, it's like meeting your neighbor. It's like meeting the grocer. It's like that we try to put them into this category of the other,
Right.
and build distance between who they are and who we are. And when we're far more alike than we'd like to admit.
That's right. Yeah, totally. And I do think that's one of the reasons too why a doctrine like this should humble us, right? And cause us to renew, in one sense, to use this the biblical language, to renew repentance, right? Like I made the comment or used the phrase there, but for the grace of God go I earlier. And again, I think that's always an appropriate phrase for us to hold on to, right? Like when I say that, it doesn't mean that I don't expect God to be doing a deep work in my life by the power of his Holy Spirit. But I expect God to do that deep work in my life by the power of his Holy Spirit, not by my own effort, not by my own striving. And again, I think that's one of the things that a lot of times people miss, right? It's like, I don't want to have anything to do with your God, right? And yet I definitely still don't feel comfortable with the idea of, people who don't have anything to do with God being consigned to a place like the what the Bible describes when it talks about hell.
Yeah.
And I would just say, to the analogy that you just used, right? Like, I mean, there were really nice Nazis, right? Like, and we all, that seed is within every single one of us. And that's one of the reasons why we need renewal. It's one of the reasons why Scripture gives us, I think, so much hope when we understand the biblical story, because we can never merit our way out of hell and into heaven, but Jesus can pull us from it, and he has merited our way into the presence of God. And I can never, fully quench hell's fires that are within me. James, the apostle James, in his epistle, he says that the tongue is set on fire by hell itself, right? Like, I can't even control my speech, but God, and this is why I think there are prayers like in Psalm 119, set a guard over the doorpost of my mouth. It's God who has to actually begin to control the tongue. And this is why, Paul says that after we've been filled with the Spirit, we're to speak the truth to one another in love, and we're to speak in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, because God is the one who by his Spirit is doing this work in us. And we want God to carry that on and to continue that maturing, completing work that he's promised to do in and through Jesus. But to say, no, I got it, I'm going to be able to take care of it on my own, it's a dangerous step in the wrong direction.
Yeah. How do you think people, or does the Bible speak to how people will react to hell? Will they feel a sense of this is terrible, but a recognition of its justice, or not?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, I know it's always hard. Are
you like pulling bits and pieces from like parables here and there to try and piece it together?
I think that's what we have to do. I mean, I do think that one thing that is clearly seen is that we know there's going to be a great day of judgment. And on that great day, whatever God decides, every knee is still going to bow and every tongue is still going to confess to the glory of God the Father that Jesus Christ is Lord. Right? Like on that day, everybody is going to very clearly say, God, you were right. Right? So there's going to be an aspect of that that's true. I think that there also does seem to be, like in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, there does seem to be an aspect of remorse that's there from the rich man. You know, it's even kind of the desire behind why it is, you know, he's hopeful that, you know, Lazarus will be able to go and speak to his brothers. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't, everybody, theologians will say, biblical scholars will say, you can't interpret all of your theology just from parables.
Yeah.
Because there's not a one-to-one correlation. This is exactly
Well, I mean,
what
like
it's
even in that, Tim Keller was like, oh, I'll even note that he's inferring that he didn't have enough information. And so it's like you could draw these conclusions that may or may not have been the point of the parable or meant to come across in the parable. You're not particularly sure. Because usually the parable has one clear message behind it, and then there's other aspects we can kind of draw out, but we're not
100%.
You don't want to,
sure.
yeah.
But I do think that, and I think it was Dallas Willard who actually said this or talked about this. I think what would be more plausible, but again, I can't necessarily point to scripture and verse on this, is that for people who have lived their life in direct antithesis to God, while they will on Judgment Day see that Jesus Christ is Lord and make that good confession, I think nevertheless, there is still going to be a hard-heartedness that is so much a part of that person's personality that they will still want to be separate from the presence of God.
Like a reluctant bending of the knee.
Right.
Well, because that actually partly answers my question was, how does, you know, every tongue shall confess and every knee shall bow? How does that fit in with, that means some of those bending the knee to Christ will also find themselves in hell?
That's right. It will be a reluctant bending of the knee for some. Like they will definitely be able to make the confession of, okay, I totally see you are Lord. But there's going to be such a, to go back to the analogy you used earlier, you know, that pea-sized form of rebellion that over the course of life grew into whatever size it was, it's going to be so large by that point that they will be like, I still don't want to be in your presence for all of eternity.
That kind of connects as well with the questions about, there's a lot of mystery around the fallen angels and Satan, and how could a being at one point recognize God's divinity and yet choose to be their own God, and is it self-deception that they've let in? And you know, I don't even know if there's a question there, but there's a lot of connections there.
Totally. Yeah. And I do think, you know, it's the idea of how, to use Lewis's phrase again, how we lock ourselves in from the inside, right? It's just like, I want to have nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, maybe to use an Old Testament analogy or kind of parallel here, you know, Pharaoh starts out when Moses comes to him and says, hey, God says, let my people go. And Pharaoh's first question is, who is this God? Like, who is this guy that thinks he can order me around?
Yeah.
Right? Like that, like, doesn't he know that I'm the king of this domain and I have all the power, and he has no right to tell me what to do. And I think that what starts in that real small kind of seed form for Pharaoh, it just grows over the course of the Exodus story. And there's this famous, I'm remembering it. I can't remember where this comes from. It's somewhere in literature, but it's quoted. If you've ever seen the second Star Trek movie, the old ones with the original
No, I
like
haven't
William
seen
Shatner and as Captain Kirk, there's this quote that in the second movie, The Wrath of Khan, Khan quotes, and it's basically, I can't remember where it is in literature. I'm going to look it up right after we finish. But he's basically, it's this famous quote of someone shaking their fist in the face of God. And they basically are saying, you know, from the I mean, it's like really, really gripping and fearful when you see it in the movie. But it's like, you know, with hell's last breath, I spit at thee. You know, like there's there's this language of just, I utterly hate you, right? And like a lot of people, I think that when they go through life right now, they kind of think, you know, much like Pharaoh, I don't know who this God is, right? Like I'm just kind of indifferent, but like careful where that indifference is going to lead you.
Yeah.
Right? Because sometimes indifference can lead you to, I ought to check this out, right? Like I really ought to look into who God is and how he's revealed himself and what he says about himself, not just hearsay, not just gossip about God, not just the caricatures that we hear about God, but like, who did God say that he was, right? And could Jesus actually be the embodied, physical, human manifestation of God in the flesh? Check that out. But a lot of people, I think they think, oh, my indifference isn't going to lead me to any place hard. And I think that actually the story of Pharaoh would prove otherwise. And the story of, like, even in the New Testament, of like, you see kind of three groups around Jesus. You see the followers, the disciples, you see the Pharisees, the religious leaders who are his clear enemies, and you just kind of see the crowd. And the crowd, what's fascinating about the crowd is they end up in one of those other two kind of
Groups.
solid groups, right? Like you either become a follower or you become a person who just hates and despises Jesus, but you can't forever live in the crowd.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's interesting too, because people will use the term like experiencing hell on earth or experience, and people will kind of talk about experiencing heaven on earth, hell on earth. And while, like you said, hell isn't earth, you know, this isn't earth, we do taste the fruit of it.
Absolutely.
It's almost, I'm thinking of it, it's almost like I'm thinking of the positive, the heaven on earth, and I'm like, it's like tasting fruit from a foreign land, and you're like, what is this fruit? Where does this come from? Like, this can only be developed in an area where there's richness and goodness, and then the opposite of that is we can experience hell on earth through our own choices. And you see people come to the recognition of that, right? They come to the end. Yeah.
And I think that's exactly why, to your point, like we do experience hell on earth. And I think that's exactly the reason why Jesus uses Gehenna as the depiction of hell, right? He's like, you know, it's right over there, right? Like it's the place where garbage goes, all of our refuse, all of our unwanted stuff, right? And it was the place where originally the fires were first kindled by human beings through their idolatrous worship, and it caused them to sacrifice the things that were actually the most dear, you know, their own children. And so absolutely we experience hell on earth, just as we experience various tastings, aspects of heaven on earth.
Yeah. Do you think, I feel like this might not be accurate, but I feel like historically it was more common decades ago to preach, the preaching style on hell was essentially scaring people into heaven. That was like a preaching philosophy. It's like hell, you're destined for hell, and scaring. And then I think people looked at that and said, well, they're missing this. And they're like, well, you're missing aspect of the gospel there, the goodness of the gospel and whatnot. And then maybe, I don't know if the pendulum swung so far the other way where then nobody talked about hell or as much. Like, what do you think the preaching philosophy on hell should be? How should we preach on hell?
Yeah.
And yeah, just thoughts there.
So one of the things that,
Or if you agree or distree with,
yeah, no,
with that
I
description.
think your description is pretty apt, and I do think the pendulum has swung exactly the way that you described it in many respects. I think that, so just as a little historical nugget here, so one of the ways that the old revivalists would actually do this is that they had what they literally called the anxious bench in some of the tent meeting revivals, where it was kind of like, I want if your conscience is being pricked, I want you sitting up here on the anxious bench, because, it's, you just, the way they would preach was so scary, kind of hellfire, brimstone, turn or burn, if you've ever heard those kinds of phrases before. And they were using the anxious bench even as a means to kind of stoke that fear all the more. And I don't think that's appropriate. I think it does absolutely miss the beauty and the richness of the gospel. But I think that maybe to kind of tie together some of the themes that we've woven together throughout this, I think that when we preach or when we teach on hell, we need to try to give the true kind of biblical perspective of it. So that's just kind of principle one, like, where does this idea get developed? Where does it come from? And, we traced some of that through, whether it's, Jesus' teaching in Matthew 25 or Revelation in the lake of fire and that nowhereville, right? Because to the second point, that allows us to connect with it at an emotional level, because it is really, really, really uncomfortable to think about. And there is an aspect of that taps into some of what the old revivalists were kind of getting into. Like, if you are comfortable with hell, like that's a real problem, right? Like, what must your character or personality already be like?
Sure.
Right. And so we need to, as we're thinking about it from a biblical perspective, we need to remember that the Bible has a lot of rich descriptions of it, that if we think about it, it helps the emotional aspects of who we are. I think third, we have to have not just thinking about our own experience of justice and injustice in the West, but we have to have a perspective of the fact that there are some incredibly heinous things that human beings have done to one another and to God's creation, and ultimately to God as the king of his creation, that deserve justice. So that gets back to Miroslav Volf's points, right? Of there's an aspect of this that is, it is actually equitable, which again ties into some of does the punishment fit the crime? And I think the answer there is yes.
Yeah.
But I think that, the richness of the perspective that the Bible has on God's new creation, on Jesus having tasted hell for us, on Jesus going to prepare another place for us, a place that has many rooms, a many mansioned kingdom, as some people refer to it in John 14. I think that is going to be the thing that at the end of the day, also needs to be the concluding mark, the downstroke, so to speak. Because I think that is more winsome. I mean, think about the way that we discipline our kids, right? Like, you can scare your kids into obedience.
Sure.
But it's usually a temporary fix. And what you really want is to woo them into obedience through love, through visions of, flourishing and wholeness and, goodness in relationship and thriving in the way that you're relating to one another. And that's what new creation is. It's shalom, as the Old Testament has it. And I think that is the contrast, right? Like, just as hell is described as that place of disorder and chaos, heaven is the place of just utter flourishing and shalom. And I think that one of the other things we probably ought to do, there's wisdom in what Jesus did when he talked about hell the way that he did. Like, part of what Jesus was doing was kind of saying, you have had experiences of this. You've had foretastes of it on earth, just as you've had foretastes of heaven. You know what the richness of living and flourishing relationships is like. That's what heaven is like, you know? And in one sense, it's kind of, it's just that moment of invitation then that contrast creates.
Yeah.
Right. And you may still have emotional questions about it all. And how do you reconcile some of these things and the difficult pictures that there are of eternal judgment? But on the flip side, it's kind of like, I think what Jesus is trying to also say, and what we should be trying to say, is like, come follow him. And all of these things, even if your answers, or if answers aren't fully given to you or fully satisfying to you, you're going to find things that you can really sink your teeth into and really drop your anchor into.
Yeah.
That's going to hold you, even though you may at times still feel the emotional tension that some of these themes can create.
Yeah.
So I think that that's the way that we ought to try to do it. And I think that you deal with these things when you come across them in the text, right? You don't, I think that one of the things that the old revivalist preachers would do is like, they would always make sure that they would talk about hell.
Yeah.
And I just think what we ought to do, because seems to be Jesus's hermeneutic and his interpretive strategy in the Gospels, especially after his resurrection, the text says that he showed from the law and the prophets where he was in the text. And so I think you just always have to land on the gospel, not with hell. You know, you're not using it as a scare technique to try to get people into the kingdom. You show them Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think he invites and draws into the kingdom. I don't know if that fully answers your question.
I think it does. I think that's a good way to wrap up, unless you have anything you want to add.
I'm good.
Okay. Well, if you have follow-up questions, send them in. Don't put them in the comments, because we don't look at them. I just saw like someone commented on something like 4 weeks ago, and I'm like, okay, I'm a month behind seeing, like, we don't even see them. No one monitors it. But yeah, thanks for being with us. We are Center Grace Church here in Beverly, Massachusetts. We are worshiping here in the Cummings Center in Beverly at 10:15 on Sundays. Come worship with us, and hopefully we'll see you this week.
Indeed. Peace.
Peace.